Welcome to Success Redefined with Dr. Tony Warner. I'm Dr. Tony, mom of 5, psychotherapist, author, and mentor. Here, you're going to find insightful discussions spanning science, psychology, and soul as the personal and professional meet, and we explore the intersection of what really matters. So success can be redefined with connection, healing, and fulfillment in mind. The main theme we're going to focus on in this episode is around faith and its interplay in our lives as leaders, parents, partners, people of society, etc. And I'm joined in this conversation with Reverend Amy Banka. We are going to have a discussion that for some may ruffle feathers, for others may be exactly what they need to hear right now on their journey in faith. This conversation is going to go into some unconventional or non-traditional perspective around faith, how faith can be a foundation that we use for success as leaders, what being a successful person of faith really looks like, and whether it's possible to even deepen your convictions in your faith and what you believe in without needing to convince, condemn, or correct others who believe or live or think differently. And that the way that we go about doing that is different than how many of us have often been taught or told. Reverend Amy Banka is the most engaging and authentic pastor that I had ever met in my entire life up until this point in my life. She's a mother of 2, she's a wife, and she is a former homeless drug addict who doesn't hide her past. She is someone who has been a secure sense of pure love in my life and continues to be even in the background to this day. Pastor Amy is currently the senior pastor at Hopewell United Methodist Church, but we met back when she first entered into being a youth pastor at the time for the first time. But this is not a conversation just for someone who identifies as Christian. That's not what this conversation is meant to really focus in on. This is a conversation for any and all who have questions or challenges or curiosities around faith in general. And if faith is interwoven in your journey right now and it's coming up as something that you want to either dive deeper in or dive differently into, this is a conversation for you. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I have a very dear friend, Reverend Amy Banka, who has been a part of my life since, gosh, how old was I? Oh my gosh. How old was I, Amy? I don't know.
You were a middle schooler.
12? Something like that. Maybe something like that. And I don't know if I've told you this or not, Amy, but during that time in my life, I know you have some awareness because of conversations we've had, but I felt pulled in many directions for many different reasons, but one of which was because I felt this deep faith inside of me, but I saw it played out differently in the church. And you were the person at that, throughout my childhood that showed me different. And that was so incredibly meaningful to me. So it's stuck with me all these years, all these, decades, I guess, later at this point. So I feel very, very privileged for you to be here and to be sharing yourself with the audience, because I know what a treasure that you have been in my life. And I just know that you're going to share so much here with folks that really need to hear it. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for asking me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. All right, we're talking about some hard stuff today, but I know you're good at talking about that. But
I'm not afraid of it.
Even when it's challenging, right? Especially when it's challenging. Your sermons have been my favorite sermons throughout my life because they're engaging. I don't think I told you this either. The last time I heard you preach, which I don't get to hear as often because we live much further away now. I brought no 2 times ago. I brought my daughter with me, and she has felt like a little bit more disconnected from church because the sermons are kind of boring for her at her age. At the time she was a preteen. And she really liked your sermon. She's like, "Oh, she's a good pastor. She does a good job preaching."
Well, one of the things that I think I discovered early on is that if I am bored with my own sermon, if I don't have a level of wonder and intrigue myself, then there's very little chance I'm ever going to communicate that to someone else or invite them to have that kind of spirit, you know? And so for me, sermons and faith in general is like a wild discovery process, right? Where I continue to be wowed and awestruck, and learn and not be so tied to whatever I thought yesterday, for example, that I can't see something new or fresh or even challenging in today. So I'm glad to hear you say that because I think that's a pretty core element to my faith and faith in general.
That sounds so different than what I think a lot of folks, I'll just speak for myself, for than what I have seen, what I have witnessed with pastors that they kind of script it out, and it's fine, but then feel like they need to follow that script. And I can feel your wonder and awe come through, right? Like to still have the curiosity and yet the conviction all at once come through. That this actually connects beautifully with some of the questions that I want to ask you today. This curiosity accompanied with this conviction and faith. So we're going to talk about faith. We're going to talk about how it interplays with our sense of success in the world as people, as leaders, and some of the nuances that happen there. But first, can you just share a little bit about yourself, where you're at now, and kind of what brought you to where you're at now, so that we can pave the way with a little bit of Amy Banka and your story?
First, maybe some of the most important things about who I am. I am married to a great guy named Mike. We've been married this year 25 years. So they've been, so now half my life we've been together, and they've been some incredibly wonderful and growth-filled years. And we're the parents of 2 daughters who are both excellent human beings. We're very proud that they have compassionate hearts and voices of advocacy for other people. That's very important to us as a family. And so that's the most important detail about who I am. I pastor a medium to large size church in Downingtown, Pennsylvania called Hopewell. And we probably can be most categorized by a spirit of mission and community engagement, and the scripture that asks us to never tire from doing good, to be not just people of faith who believe certain things, but people who have a faith that grows legs and walks itself into the world, right? To make a difference. Otherwise, what good is it? And so it's probably nothing short of miraculous that I'm in the position that I'm in, especially coming from the place where I came from. So I was born in Philadelphia, grew up with a single mom and an absent father. And by the time I was 13, was full-blown drug addict, homeless, living on the streets, and I don't think anybody expected that I would live to be 18, let alone to be where I am now. And so, part of my story is one of great transformation. That's a core part of what faith means to me, because I've seen it happen real time. Not that that's a quick or easy process by any means. I don't think it is for anybody, whether they're a person of faith or they're not. But for me, just a lifelong process of transformation where I continue to set my eyes on the good things that God casts before me, and finding the next step towards that on a daily basis. So I have the privilege of serving alongside some excellent human beings. And sometimes I think I can't believe this is my job, to lead people in some pretty incredible, life changing endeavors. So that's maybe the snapshot about how I see myself and my journey to today.
Mm. And even just hearing you say, like, you can't believe this is your job. Like, to me, when I see you, there's just never ever been a question or doubt in my mind that it's not just your job. Like, this is your calling. Like, this is your purpose. Like, this, you just fit so beautifully in this space that is welcoming and also nurturing of faith in a deep convicted way. Like, it's for me, it's been rare to see that. It's been so rare to see that. And that's one of the things actually I remember when I first met you back when I was a kid, and you became my youth pastor, was that you were honest about your past. At no point did I feel like you tried to cover it up or lie to me or pretend, you were this or that. You were so honest with me as a kid, and I needed that. I really needed that. And I've seen you hold on to that value, that core value in your life and your work and your parenting, in your marriage, like just across the years that I've known you. And I just think that that's such an inspiration thing.
But I think there's so much shame in the world, but I don't believe there is shame in redemption ever. I think it's victorious. And so I don't think there's a reason to be secretive about the places where I've been and where I've come from, and the work that I've done and the work that God has done in order to make that victory possible. So for me, there's no need for me to carry that shame, and there's no need for me to ask anyone else to either. Right? I was just reading something by a priest named Father Gregory Boyle. I don't know if you've heard of him. He runs Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, and he says something like, "I'm going to get his quote wrong, but if you like it, Google him and you'll get the right quote." It's something about those who can see their own wounds will not be tempted to despise the wounds of others.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's a really important perspective for us to hold as human beings. That when we see ourselves in a holistic way, not just the bad things about ourselves, but the good things as well, when you balance our perspective of ourselves and remain right sized, then we won't be tempted um, to look at anyone else in an imbalanced way. I think that's really important in life, and something that I try very hard to do. I fail often, but I try to do that. These people did that for me.
Mm. It's wondrous to me because what you're talking about here is so synchronous with the questions that have come up for me as I've been reflecting on what I want to ask you today. And it just ties so beautifully in. Okay. So when I think about how I have seen people want to be successful as people of faith, there are two common kind of overarching ones that I see that have caused a lot of challenges and pain. And those two are, I need to be right. Like, I need to be right in my convictions. And because I'm right in my convictions, I need to either convince or condemn others. Right. So if convince others of my convictions, and if they aren't in agreement with that, then I need to condemn them. That's kind of the first overarching one. And then the other one is like this idea of being God-fearing, We may or may not get to that one today because I think that's probably a whole can of worms in and of itself, but it might interweave with some of what we want to talk about because I take issue. It doesn't fit for me to fear a God of love. Um, and yet there's so much pushback and controversy around that when I share that with folks, like the God that I believe in, the creator that I believe in, this source of energy, light, and life that I believe in, it, it's not about fear, right? So this is two overarching ones, but do you agree with those two overarching ones as to some of what you see people are trying to do to be successful, air quotes, right? Successful people of faith, or are yours different? Would you say you see different ones? And I'm sure there's plenty of them, but just top two.
Yeah. Well, first, let me maybe we can just sort of disarm that second one a little bit by saying that, in my opinion, that the translation God fearing in is to me a mistranslation of Hebrew. First of all, um, so when the word fear is used, I think we describe it as sort of like a frightening experience, but really. Really in Hebrew, it means more like awestruck.
Mm.
And so, I think if we're told that we have to be afraid, frightened by a God who loves us, then we will have, a theological discrepancy there, right? How does that happen? But if we are more rightly perhaps told that we should be in awe of the majesty, the wonder, the power of the God who loves us, then for me, there's no discrepancy there.
Mm.
Um, so I think God fearing is a strange term to me because I think it's a mistranslation. Um, but the first one, so to me, that would never be a category of success for me to be afraid or to be forced into some kind of relationship or level of obedience out of fear. And I think just the entirety of Jesus's life and ministry speaks wildly against that. So I always err on the side of Jesus as my plumb line there. Um, and so if Jesus isn't asking me to be afraid of him, I think then maybe it's helpful for me to go back and rethink some of that earlier teaching that, you or I may have received, that in my opinion, was crafted more to get people to listen and obey than to wonder at God.
Mm.
So the first one for me is a challenge as well because I view it as a sign of insecurity. So if I am requiring everyone to be where I am, either in thought or in action or in heart, um, I think that comes from a place of control, which I perceive to be an act of insecurity. Um, and so for me, success is not about creating. Um, how do I want to say this? It's not about demanding that everyone believes exactly what I believe at the time I believe it, right? And who I am now is not who I was 5 or 10 or 25 years ago. And I think, going back to what I said about transformation is, we all have this beautiful opportunity in our lives to continue the process of becoming. And I think it is, I think it is almost unholy for me to try to um, take that away from someone.
Mm.
And so I don't view that as success. I view that as insecurity.
Which is interesting, right? Because insecurity also ties in then to the fear, right? If I'm feeling insecure, I'm feeling this fear. So what would you say you most often see folks who are like, I want to be a good person of faith? Maybe they come to you saying, I want to be a good Christian woman or a good Christian man or a good Christian leader. Um, but I want to be a good, a correct, we're using the word successful here, right? In this podcast, person of faith. And I feel like I'm failing because like, what are the areas that you most often see, maybe the top one or two that people can get stuck in or really struggle with?
I think it's when their definitions or their limitations are so rigid. Um, so for example, I have to believe the right thing. I have to pray the right prayer. When there's a rigidity to faith, I think we're maybe on the wrong track there. And I can say that there have been times in my life where it's been important for me to know what I believe. And probably times where people would say, and I can, confess that I have wanted other people to believe what I believe, especially when I I hear people saying things that I think are particularly damaging. But I have to sort of go back to a posture of humility and say, everyone is in the process of becoming. In fact, you know, a young uh, a young middle schooler said at Hopewell recently, you have to be gracious to people because everyone is living life for the first time,
Hmm.
and it was just so convicting to me. Where are the places where I may not be allowing that? So for me, success is less about the rigidity and more about that process of becoming. Have I positioned myself to move through the world as a person of faith, kindness, and to move through it in a way that mirrors Jesus's interactions with people, where he never seems to tire of allowing that process of transformation to occur.
Hmm.
I don't know how he does that some days, because some days I am really quick to just want people to be in a certain spot. But part of the joy of the job that I have is being invited into those conversations with people to watch that work happen. So I would say, when people ask me those questions, like, can you help me be a good Christian? The answer for me is not, here's the box of things you need to do, or the prayers you need to pray, or the number of times you need to sit in this pew per year, or what have you. But it really is evidenced in how can we mirror the ideals and the practices of the one we claim to follow? How
Mhm.
well do we do that? How willing are we to constantly be invited into places of new life and discovery? To me, that is success as a person of faith. The rigidity, the requirement that other people believe the way I believe, to me is growth resistant.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, there's so many like avenues, right, that we could go down with that. For the leaders in particular, so the folks who are leading, whether they're leading in church or outside of church in the community, but they are a person of faith and they want their faith to be a part of how they lead. So they want to be the successful leader who is also being successful in their faith. And sometimes I think that can feel like it's at odds. How how do we go about doing that when we are living in a world right now that does tend to push the rigidity, that does tend to push that control, that forcefulness, that because I believe this, right? So because these are my convictions and I am the leader, I need to, X, Y, or Z, that box, so to speak. How do we navigate that in a way that feels successful without dishonoring our faith, without feeling like we're failing as a leader? And I know this is a really complex, kind of convoluted question, but it's an intersection that I think a lot of folks bump up against.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's maybe a little bit of a different definition about what does it mean for me to be a person of faith in the workplace. And even though I'm leading a church, I'm also leading a staff in a school, and there are business elements to that as well. So how I show up in the places where I get invited is very important. And my belief is that it is much less about my ability to say the right things than it is for me to embody the right spirit. So for example, when our community was really struggling with a series of teen suicides, I was really blown away and honored to be invited to the table of discussion about how our community was going to sit vigil and address the school system. And I got invited to the table of conversation, and it happened to be at a restaurant, right? And there was this long room with two very long tables, and I remember walking into that, looking at one table was the mayor and social workers and people who had tremendously important but albeit prestigious jobs. And at the other table was a group of grief-stricken teenagers who knew the people that we were talking about. And in that instant, I really felt convicted that I had to ask the question, privately and prayerfully, Jesus, if you were here, where would you sit?
Hmm.
And so I knew instantly where I should sit. And even though the mayor was saying, Amy, come and sit with me, I couldn't, because I knew that my call to that space was to help give voice to the students who were crying and couldn't actually get their words out, right? And to be supportive. So it was much less about, was I quoting a scripture at them, or, was I telling them how to feel, as much as it was for me to just bring the spirit of love, which I do perceive to be the spirit of Christ, into that space, and just be present there. Um, as it turned out, all of those professionals were talking over the teens, and they were really feeling frustrated and I'm not heard. And so I was then able to use my voice to call for silence so that they could be handed the floor. I was glad I sat where I sat. And I don't think that the work I did was insignificant as a person of faith, but it didn't require me to pray any prayers, quote any scriptures, require anyone to believe anything other than the value of the people about which we were talking. So for me, that was a moment of success, but it was anything but rigid, right? And so
Mm.
I would say that in our workplaces or wherever we go, it is not. I think sometimes we've been told that sharing our faith in the workplace is about having the right answers, quoting scripture, leading people to Jesus, and so forth. And I just am convicted that people are convicted by how we show up much more than whatever Bible verse we have into our cubicle.
Hearing you talk about that brings tears to my eyes. Surprising. I didn't expect myself to have tears come to my eyes, but um, because you know you're familiar with some of my history. That when I guess I was 19 or 20, I was hospitalized, mandatory hospitalization, um, from what folks would call a suicide attempt. I did not call it that, but there's this part of me that I think felt connected when you said that you saw the gap and you weren't getting pulled into the social. You're aware of it. These are the social expectations of where I should sit, right? Or, oh, well, these are the expectations of what I should say as a pastor if I go over that way and try to preach to them. And it was, you didn't go in those directions, which would have been more of the rigid directions for us to go in, and easy for many of us to go in. But instead, you turned inward and you really allowed yourself to ask about the most meaningful way to connect. And I think that so much of the pain and the shame that happens when people are trying to ascribe to these rigid, successful things, right? Roles, expectations of being this successful leader who's also this successful faith person, you can get sucked into it, but it takes you away, it moves you away from the meaningful connection. And I remember after I was hospitalized, it was not a positive experience at all. Talk about a gap, like
Yeah.
what's not that positive experience. But at some point I did share my testimony at the church that I was at the time. And my mom was pastoring that church at the time. And someone came up to my mom after I shared my testimony and said, "Oh, but it wasn't that bad, was it?" And how painful that was to hear for my mom as having seen me go through it. But for me, as having just stood up in front of the church, sharing that vulnerable of a testimony for the first time and not be received with an awareness of meaningful connection. Instead, it felt more like judgment or condemnation or dismissing. It's that gap, right? Like that you saw. And yet the gap continues to exist because I think because of these often rigid definitions of how we're supposed to appear successful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's in some cases about what we're valuing too, right? So if in that moment my value um, or my definition of success really was to improve my social standing or to get a couple business cards or invitations to be in other places, then I would have made a different choice, right? But for me, the definition of success is less about what I am achieving, less about how I am being perceived in the room by the people who are there with me, and more about how am I using my life and to what end. And so, that's it's taken me, 50 years to get to the place where I am now. So, if you had this podcast with me 25 years ago, I may have been answering these questions very differently. But one of the things that I learned from Jesus is that he was very critical of those um, rigid, rule-based systems of engaging the complexity of people. Right? People are complex much more than any of us can see on a given day. And so it requires us to have connection with people to be able to one appreciate that complexity, right? It's a beautiful thing. It's also sometimes a messy thing. And to be able to stand in places where we can see both. Again, back to that balance of being able to actually engage one another on a human level with appreciation for both of those things. To me, that is much more clearly an expression of Jesus's life rather than the institutional Christianity that was created afterwards. And that's very much rule based, and it was that existed before as well, and it happened to be the thing that Jesus criticized the most. So for those of us who say we are people of faith, we have to be willing to be challenged in that way when we do sort of slip into this more rigid place of believing that people have to subscribe to a certain thoughts or behaviors. And when we do that, they're mostly the ones we subscribe to, right? That we require others to have. And instead, really enter into a human relationship and connection with people that allows us to see, what theologians call the imago Dei, the image of God in each person, and appreciate that and the differences. And again, back to that awesome a picture of God, right? When we can't see the differences in each other as expressions of God's majesty,
Mm,
we can never really embrace God's majesty.
I love that.
So, again, for me, it's just a journey of wonder and being able to continuously ask the question, If you were here, Jesus, what would you do? And I don't mean that in the very hokey WWJD. I really do not like that. I don't have any bracelets and I think, they should all be recycled into something else. But I think that rather than wearing a bracelet or a mantra, we should be chasing an attitude.
Mm.
Um, I do believe that, and that's my definition of success as a person of faith. It finds its way into the workplace. Um, in some ways, I think that are very important. And so, for example, participating in an interview process for a new employee where we see potential, latent racism come to the surface, and know that in that space, if I'm asking Jesus, what would you do? That means that I need to address that. It means I need to create an opportunity for becoming for everyone who's in there, and invite them into something new. It means that when someone is struggling with an illness, that I need to give more grace to that person in that time period, because they're doing their best just to make it to work some days, And so really it's about how am I engaging people as a person of faith, and how can they tell by being in my presence that I am a follower of Jesus,
Mm.
not by what I say, but by how I show up.
Yeah. There are two statements that I want to bring up here to accompany this conversation as we kind of move towards the last several minutes. Um, that I will say, even I have in my adulthood tried to be very cognizant of. And one of them, you and I have discussed before. Um, and it goes about, is the older I am, the more I know that there's so much I don't know. And yet, that's not right. The more experience I have, because I don't think it's necessarily an age thing. The more experience I gain, right? The more I learn and grow, the more I realize there's so much more I don't know. I would separate age from that. Um, and yet there is a depth in convictions that can happen all at the same time. And so I want to put that here, let's say on the left side. And then on the right hand side, there's this statement that is, I stood for how does it go? I think Katy Perry sings it in her song. I stood for nothing, so I fell for everything. And how do we allow ourselves? It seems like it's paradoxical, right? How do we allow ourselves to grow deeper in our convictions so that we are living sturdier within them, while also staying open to this growth, this, as you said, becoming, this ongoing evolution and transformation, without losing this grip on what matters most to us, so that we don't wind up falling for things, or getting sucked into things, or getting pulled away from what our real convictions are, or our true core values are.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right to say that with experience, or I might even add with growth, right?
Mhm.
Because even experience, I mean, we can go through the world and get older and have more experiences, and it still doesn't necessarily shape us in a positive or life giving way, right? So I think I think it was actually your mom's cousin when I was working at Drexel. Um, who said to me, the older I get, the less I know for sure. And I was 20 something, and I remember going home and thinking, how does that work? But now that I am the age I am, which is probably similar to the age he was at the time, I agree with that. It's to me, it's not about what I know, but what I know deeply. So I think, at earlier stages in my life, it might have been about knowing a lot, right? And I know a lot, but what are the things I know deeply?
Hmm.
Those are fewer. in my life now. And, in my faith, I know a lot of things religiously. Um, but the things that are deep for me are all related to my relationship to Christ, which is very simple. It's not easy by any means, but it is very simple. And so it is allowing ourselves the process of becoming or molting or like however you want to talk about it, where some parts of who we were yesterday are allowed to be shed and left behind, um, and understanding with greater clarity where those places of depth really are and putting a lot of emphasis there.
Mm.
And some of the other things that I might know on more of a surface level or wide level, they're not as important to me anymore as they once were. Um, but those other things are non-negotiables for who I am and who I think we all are as people and who I think God is.
Mm.
So for me, it's this process of depth and clarity in the things that are simply and profoundly true that enable me to let go of all of the other things that could be shed.
Mm. I love that because it speaks, I think, directly to this conversation we're having around how do we redefine success as people of faith that are also many of us are also leaders in some capacity or another, is so much of this information heavy world. And I totally will raise my hand, right? I've got my PhD, multiple masters, like all this stuff, right? Like this information heavy world that focuses on like, oh, success is about the accomplishments and the this breadth of information, right? That you can prove that versus a different kind of success, what I call this inward, this internally felt success, which is so much more fulfilling and satisfying, right? That goes deep and is about the 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 profound internal connection to self, to source, and to what in your whether you can put words to it or not. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I can't put words to it.
Yeah, when
It's
my nephew was living with me and he was chasing a job, he was like running himself into the ground chasing a job, and he was really achievement based in his definition of success. And he said to me, calls me Annie, um, what do you think about that? And I said to him, at the end of your life, your character will be infinitely more impressive. And so, we're all going to come and go. Um, and people may or may not remember the achievements that we made, but people will for sure remember the impact that our lives and character have made in the shaping of future generations. Um,
Mm.
that's really important to my definition of success. Not because I want people to talk well about me when I'm dead, although that would be nice, but because my life is a gift and I want to use it well.
Your life is a
And
gift and you want to use it well.
yeah, and so that requires me to broaden my definition of success to be not merely about what I achieve, but what we achieve together, right?
Mm. Mm. That's so beautiful.
And some people might suggest that's foolish, and I am really okay with that. I'm okay with that because, again, I can see how people get to an achievement based definition, and I can see how people who have great accomplishments are also phenomenal contributors to the world. So I don't want to give the impression that that definition is flawed. It's just not mine.
That's okay. I'll say it's flawed because because I've lived it and seen so many get sucked into it as well. And the achievement based definition of success is a measurement based definition, and that's fine, but that's not fulfillment. That's not fulfilling success. That's not meaningful success. It's not life-giving, inspiring success from the inside out. That is outward success that we're trying to keep moving towards to affect how we inwardly feel. And when we do that, it backfires. I know
Yeah.
because I've been right. Like I've seen it time and time again, even outside of myself. But you can achieve a lot outwardly. And if you're what folks will call detached from that being what makes you feel successful as a human being, as a person of faith, as a woman, as a man, as whomever you are, as the being that you are, if you're able to detach that from what it is for you to really feel fulfilled and successful in your life, then those outward accomplishments, those successes, they're great. They're not inherently wrong or bad. But if they become your pure measurement of success, then they hurt you. They do. Ultimately, they wear you out.
And I think where we get into trouble in religious settings, in particular Christianity, is when we give the wrong statement. I do believe this is a wrong statement, that those achievements are um, like rewards from God. Like if you are receiving all of these things, then you must be favored, you must be blessed, you must be doing something right. Right. And the obvious antithesis to that is that if you don't have all of those things, then you're obviously doing something wrong. Those are some of the damaging things that have circled Christianity, and I think should frankly get recycled like those bracelets, because they're not actually helpful in us learning how to follow Jesus. That was not an ethic of his. And so for me, some of this is sort of being able to disconnect what is the religious institution that we may participate in and draw life from, but also be able to see the flaws in. And what is the difference between that and the ethic of Jesus, and being able to call it when we see the disconnect there, and then maybe retire those things that we don't need anymore. That's all part of the shedding for me. I don't think that requires us to shed our faith, just to be aware that some of the things that we constructed as human beings served a time and a place and might not anymore. Right. And so I just want to say to anyone who's in a position of leadership and contemplating the relationship between leadership and faith, that to see it as some kind of call or blessing from God is really antithetical to the ethic of Christ. And so if you're not achieving, then you're not doing something bad. Like if you're not seeking a lot of position and prestige and reputation, it's not as though God is not favoring you. I really struggle when I hear things like that, because I think people internalize that, they
Yep.
take it to heart, they believe leaders, and I think that those are really damaging and incorrect statements. So
And it fuels shame and blame, not just for folks that are witnessing, bearing witness to the leader, but also for the leader themselves. Because if we're honest, the leaders that are doing that tend to then not feel that fulfillment inside. Right. So it's like, well, if I'm being favored and getting all of these things and achieving all this stuff, but I still don't actually feel fulfilled, is there something wrong with me? And then you have to keep it secret because you're a leader and you're a person of faith and like you can't show flaws. And that just creates shame and blame. And it's like shame and blame shower all over the place. And that contributes to the rigidity that we see, because when we're in shame and blame, we're in a place of survival, protection, defense, right? And then
yeah,
we see all or nothing. So there's so many layers. But I think this was a really important conversation for us to have. We probably could have millions of conversations around these topics. But you said something to me once that I want to include it in the end of this podcast. You said, it stuck with me. And if I'm saying it correctly, you tell me. You said, my faith is not so fragile that it can't handle your questions. It was something like that. That stuck with me because I'm like, so often there's this idea that to be a successful leader who is also successful in faith, that they are right, that they are right, that they know all, that they can figure it all out, that right. But no, actually, we can be challenged. And when you have that depth in your faith and your knowing of your faith, that internal connection between you and your God, you and your source, then it can handle the questions, the challenges, heck, even the traumas.
Yeah. That sounds like something I would have said.
I remember.
Yeah, and I think we often get this mixed messaging, that we have to have that clarity at all times. We have to be able to vocalize it, and we have to be able to, present that as, something that people should ascribe to. Honestly, again, I just view that as a great indication of insecurity, because none of us is right all the time. None of us. And that's actually a little bit of a prison, the quest to be right. Who said it? I just preached a sermon, and I was just talking about how in the quest to be right, we often forget to be loving.
Hmm.
And but my understanding is that God never asks us to be right, but often asks us to be loving. And so when my main priority is to convince you that I am right, I have already created a differential between us, that love will have a hard time hurdling, right? And so, if my goal is to see instead, how is God moving and making something known or visible in the midst of our conversation, through which we can both learn, that's a much more humble and I think healthy spirit, right? So, sometimes I feel right like everyone else. And especially, as I said, when I hear things that I think are really damaging. But in those moments, I think it's much better for us to assume a spirit of curiosity rather than judgment, not just about what the other person thinks, but what God might be inviting us to learn or become in the midst of that conversation, right? So
Right.
even if our perspective is quote unquote right, we still have a lot to learn about how to engage with each other in the process. And so I said a lot through the pandemic, even if I am right and I come with the wrong spirit, I am still wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of some of the sermons that Martin Luther King
Yeah.
had given that stick out to me. And I've often repeated to myself and to many clients as well, this reminder of connection before correction, connection before convincing, right? Let's put the connection ahead of that and then see where that takes us. But
Yeah.
I have a closing question for you. And this closing question is simply, and yet also complex, but simply put, is what is your redefined definition of success for you as a leader of faith now in your life?
For me, my redefined definition of success is my day by day ability to focus my eyes on God and to do my very best to imitate what I see God doing around me.
Mm. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for asking.
Oh, for sharing your wisdom, yourself, your time, your energy. If folks want to connect with you, learn more about your work that you're doing in the world, where could they find you?
I would say, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not a tremendous contributor to either of those platforms. But I would say that if people are interested in thinking about some of these topics, the best place to first engage me is maybe on Hopewell's YouTube page. You get to see who I really am, my heart, my presentation by listening to me preach. I am 100% myself in those moments. And so you can find that at hopewellumc.org. And the links to that social media page are there. But that really is maybe the best way to get to know me a little bit better, and also a way to start a personal conversation with me there as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being here with us as well, for spending your time with us, which is an incredibly precious gift for you to be able to do with us and choose to share with us. If you are on YouTube, go ahead and contribute below in the comment section. You can ask us questions. You can add your contributions. Let's continue to cultivate a community that allows for meaningful connection, growth, and success that feels good to us, that's healthier for each of us, and then goes out and makes positive ripples out in the world. Bye, everyone.
I
Links related to this episode can be found in the show notes section. Want to submit questions about success, satisfaction, healing, and relationships, health, or work? You can do that free and anonymous at drtonywarner.com, where you'll find other resources there as well. Did you benefit from this episode? You can subscribe, like, and share with another to pass it on, because anyone can listen on the go with this podcast audio available on all major podcasting platforms.